Joining us now to talk about the life and legacy of Mr. Carter is Jay Hakes. Jay, thank you so much for joining us today. You know, one of the things I just mentioned was just how integral the Carter Center has been in this state funeral. You all have been with the Carters. You worked with them for many years. How special that, you know, part of his goodbye was a thank you to many of you who had continued some of this work along the way.
Yeah, I really look at it as three events. A couple of years ago, they had, Jimmy and Rosalind had their 75th wedding anniversary in Plains, and a bunch of us were invited down, and they were able to communicate well at that time, and we sort of realized that that was, you know, perhaps the last big public event like that. And then, of course, Rosalind's funeral was not too long ago there in Atlanta, and now the big event, 100-year-old president passing away, and a big event at the National Cathedral in Washington coming up on Thursday. So it's been sort of a long goodbye in a way with the hospice, but it's also been a time to celebrate. And those of us who I first met him in 1975 and worked closely with him for many years, it's a time to celebrate all that he accomplished and also his vision for the future, which is implemented in many ways through the work of the Carter Center.
You know, Jay, I was thinking about your ties to the U.S. Interior Secretary, and something that Jimmy Carter doesn't really receive a lot of attention for or a lot of credit for during his White House years was his expansion of the national park system. I mean, I think it's something that we take for granted here in 2025, but at the time that he did that, I mean, this is a significant move that certainly will impact generations that have not been born yet. I mean, it's such an important part of American life, and yet we don't talk about it a lot.
Yes, that's a very good point. The impact was massive. Before Carter, the idea of an urban national park really didn't exist. They were thought to be things that were just kind of off in the wild, away from people. So that was a big breakthrough. Also, he came in at the point where he led the Congress of how we were going to deal with Alaska, but basically forever, and that was the big ecosystem in North America that was pretty much as God created it. And so that was a big part of it. And then, just as you say, the parks and wildlife areas were basically doubled. And he had a supportive Congress for that. And it's something we all enjoy today. And I think it's important for us to remember that Carter played a big role in that.
Do you find yourself reflective today as the casket makes its way to Washington, D.C., that Washington, D.C. was the reason for his ascension on the national political scene when he was viewed as an outsider versus Gerald Ford, and certainly as a result of the Nixon years, that was a strength. Yet his Achilles also was Washington, D.C., his inability to maneuver within the system, how different it was from being a governor in Georgia, and how difficult it was trying to get anything done with Congress.
Well, he ruffled a few feathers when he went up there. You know, he didn't like having Hail to the Chief played. This was in the post-Nixon era, so there was kind of a reaction against the grandiose presidency. And that hurt him a little bit. But I think as the historians are going back in my books, and Jonathan Alter or Kai Bird, the success record of Carter with Congress was kind of overlooked. I mean, he passed civil service reform. He diversified the judiciary with the support of Congress. The Congress got a 2/3 vote to ratify the Panama Canal Treaty, which is pretty amazing. Passed massive energy legislation. So that record actually, I think, as we get further away from the period and let the historians look at it statistically, he had a Democratic Congress behind him, and they, fussed at each other from time to time. But you look at his record, number of bills passed and things like that. There's a display on this at the Carter Library, the museum there, and it compares pretty well with Lyndon Johnson. And that's not been the perception of Carter, but he got a lot done.
Do you think the perception is certainly mired in the fact that maybe no one would have succeeded given the economic situation of the late 1970s, given the rise of Islamic fundamentalism throughout the Middle East in the late 70s with the Ayatollah Khomeini? Was he a victim of his circumstances in many ways in the White House, do you think?
Yes and no. I think when you're in the White House, you have to accept, kind of responsibility, but you're also limited by the cards that you're dealt. So, you had the Arab oil embargo in 1973-74, and this had a huge inflationary impact. And it was, I think, one of the reasons that people were mad at Nixon, not just Watergate, and they were mad at Gerald Ford, and they were mad at Jimmy Carter about inflation. And a lot of these were oil-based, and they were things that had built up over the years. And when the Shah was over, in 1978, Carter had just passed the energy bill, and everybody was feeling good, and they just had negotiated Camp David. But then if you look at the records, that was when the first notices came in, well, the Shah is looking very shaky, and he might be overthrown. And by July of 1979, the Shah had fled the country. So that was a situation that had built up with numerous presidents going back to Eisenhower, and Carter it happened on his watch. So I think it's good to look at the things that led into the Carter presidency, and then some of the things he did that we're benefiting from today that we forget where they started. In many cases, they started with Carter.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Mr. Jay, for joining us and continuing to help us reflect on the remarkable legacy of President Carter. Thank you so much.
Good to be with you.
Thank you.
It's been incredible, and I know that one of the things I've loved about what we've seen over the last few days is just how much Georgia played a role in this state funeral. As we mentioned, Jimmy Carter could have pretty much had this go any way he wanted, but the fact that this is all going to end in Georgia and it all started here in Georgia is really, I think, remarkable.
Mm-hmm.
It is. I was also thinking about Jay Hakes there for a moment, as we have talked with some of the officials from that Carter era of people that were with him in the White House. And it is interesting, the interpretation of Jimmy Carter. Here we are talking about, burying him in the next day or two, and the sort of interpretation of current events, the interpretation of what he represented, not only in the White House, but certainly after the White House, is really up to a broad brush of interpretation, that everybody seems to have their own take on his life and times. It's endlessly fascinating, and it makes for conversations that are without end, certainly, and it makes these kinds of forums a lot of fun, because everybody seems to have a different view of his life, and sometimes it's not great, but most of the time the one thing that we're all in agreement that he is of which we have never seen before or probably will see again.
Yeah.